The following video contains personal stories of Indigenous people who have experienced homelessness. Drug use, violence, foster care, residential school, and recounting traumatic experiences are discussed. Residential school survivors, their families, and Indigenous people dealing with intergenerational trauma can access mental health and crisis supports through the Indian Residential School Survivors Society at 1-800-721-0066. Others affected by this content can call 310 Mental Health at 310-6789.
This is Gingosh. It is my family's home. Walking through the forest near Gingosh, I feel the history of the place of trees. I sense time of another having lived. I walk where my grandfather walked. It is familiar without having been there. It is knowing my place. It is knowing my space. I carry it with me, with it in my heart. I know respect.
Simigiget sigram hanak kulsik lugiget swai niskani wobdakani kicking gosh. Skaram Mokasam. My English name is Patrick Stewart. My Niska name is Lukigio. I'm a member of the Killer Whale House of Dakin, the Niska village of Kingosh. I was born homeless. So when I was born, my mom was homeless. And the hospital wouldn't let her take me from there because she was homeless. She had no place to take me. So I was left at St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. From the hospital, though, I went into care, and I grew up in care. I aged out at 19. For me now, when I look back at the work that I do, I always consider kids in care as being homeless because security of tenure is not there. I just remember months and years of wondering if I'm going to stay where I am or am I going to be moved, and it's not a good feeling to have. I tried to go to school on that basis, and I just had too many anxieties, I think. Wondering, okay, social worker going to show up, or am I going to be moved? I don't know. And I just worried. I think I was just a constant worrier.
What comes to mind when you think of home? Is home a structure with 4 walls where we go inside, eat, play, rest, and are out of sight? Is home where the heart is? Or is home wherever we are? Is home individual ownership of a space or private property that can be bought and sold? These shared ideas have come to shape Western and Canadian understandings of home. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Indigenous worldviews are distinct from these perspectives. In many Indigenous worldviews, home is circles of relationships that come together to form healthy communities and feelings of deep-rootedness. In English, these circles of relationships are known among many Indigenous peoples as all my relations. Home is a person's place in nature, their relationships, and their connection to community and territory. From many Indigenous perspectives, home is more than a built structure. Home is holistic and reciprocal. Home is more about cultural connections than any built structure. Home is made up of the relationships and connections to the land and nature, other living things, culture, community, identity, and spirituality. Colonization in Canada brought different values that favored and reinforced home as a built structure that a person lives in and can be bought, sold, and profited from. These two different ways of understanding what home is have been at the center of Canada's conflict between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And the effects have been devastating. In 2021, 39% of survey respondents in the point-in-time homeless counts in BC identified as Indigenous, but they represent only 6% of the population. Patrick Stewart, a member of the Niska Nation, architect and chair of the Provincial Indigenous Homelessness Committee in BC, has been working alongside the Luma Native Housing Society to advise on the point-in-time counts for Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness.
Point-in-time counts are done federally mandated every 3 years. As a point-in-time count, it takes a snapshot of the number of people that are homeless at one night, and it tries to get an idea of who's on the street, who's in shelter. It's always recognized as being an undercount because, not everybody, you can't find everybody.
These point-in-time counts are like a single picture taken at a single moment in time every 3 years. It does not tell the story of how a person arrived in the picture. What's more, the picture is also blurry and missing information.
It's a work in progress, and we're still attempting to influence how the count is run, what questions are asked, but there's still a long way to go because, for example, there's a big portion of the population that we don't talk to or know much about, and that's hidden homelessness. People that are hidden homeless are people that are either couch surfing, staying with family, in hospitals, in remand centers, all those places that nobody really goes and finds out.
The kinds of questions point-in-time counts ask and the data they collect reinforce colonial understandings of home. They favor the idea that home is a built structure where a person lives instead of a person's circles of relationships. And they do not tell the whole story of Indigenous homelessness, which involves the negative impacts and lived realities of colonial policies and practices. Bernice Carmano, an Indigenous outreach worker in Victoria, BC, shares the key challenges in helping Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness from within colonial systems.
The majority of the people that I work with have either gone through the foster care system, residential school, or a combination of both. So they react in two ways. They're either aggressive and people say they're angry, and it's difficult for them to connect or even do the work around getting them situated in housing, however that looks. And the other side of that is people are so quiet. They won't even respond to anyone. And that's really challenging because they just slip through the cracks.
Because of the bias within our systems and institutions that favor a colonial and Western understanding of home and homelessness, Indigenous peoples have explored ways to define homelessness better. A definition of homelessness that will tell their story and better serve Indigenous people facing homelessness.
We've really never had homelessness growing as our ancestors, but now we do. And they're just over the hill here in our own territory. And that bugs me more than anything, I guess, is the lack of action that our communities have to reach out and pull our people back to where they belong. They're walking around with no place to live in their own homeland. So when we're talking Indigenous homelessness, I really don't think it's homelessness. We have homes. We have our traditional territory is our home, and we don't have any place to live in our own territories.
Many Indigenous worldviews don't define sleeping rough or lacking a built structure to live in as homelessness. Instead, these are understood to be the symptoms of homelessness. Over hundreds of years of colonization and the deliberate destruction of Indigenous homes by the Canadian state, the circles of relationships that once rooted Indigenous peoples have been severely damaged, undermined, and displaced. From conversations with Indigenous peoples, leaders, and researchers across Canada, 13 circles of homelessness have been identified that more fully share their stories. These 13 circles aren't a complete list, but they can help us to see the picture more clearly and guide our path through the forest. Historic displacement from Indigenous lands during the height of colonization. Ongoing separation of an individual or community from Indigenous lands and territories as a result of colonial control. Spiritual disconnection from Indigenous worldviews and beliefs. Mental disruption and imbalance from colonial policies that marginalize Indigenous peoples on a social and economic level. Loss of cultural identity and loss of Indigenous circles of relationships. Overcrowded, unsafe, and unhealthy living spaces. Lack of access to work, education, recreation, and essential services. Lack of access to safe, stable, and culturally appropriate shelter and housing. Difficulty moving back to home communities due to lack of housing, discrimination, or disconnection. Escaping or fleeing from harm. Natural and man-made disasters, as well as inadequate emergency plans and services. Escaping the effects of climate change, causing drastic changes in subsistence patterns, food sources, and relationships to the land. The ongoing destructive impact of the child welfare system in Canada, which deprives Indigenous children of the circles of relationships that root and nourish them. These 13 circles of disconnection layer on top of one another to create Indigenous homelessness in Canada and enable it to take root. Indigenous peoples are working to reconnect the circles of relationships that once defined Indigenous societies. A return to Indigenous visions of home will light our pathway forward. Auntie Glow, an elder at the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness, shares that vision.
The main goal is to make tomorrow a better place for our people who are living away from home. You can't just put them in an apartment and say, that's it. It's just being there or out for a forest walk or have the opportunity to go with our spiritual leader, Fred, and just reconnect with Mother Earth. They don't have that opportunity in the city. The noise, the cement, having to line up, and the systemic racism, where when they come into our presence, they've got their dignity back. They are treated with dignity and, as I say, non-judgmental, and it's just that love.
Here are 11 stories, 11 different people and organizations. They are each, in their ways, lighting the pathway home for themselves and others. And we hope that these stories will spark your imagination and belief in the transformative power of Indigenous knowledge and ways of being, and that they cultivate trust, hope, healing, and empowerment. Together, we can reimagine new approaches to housing and home that builds cultural self-identity, dignity, family, and purpose. Our systems will change, and so will our communities. But the change won't feel like a change at all. It will feel familiar, even though we've never been there before.
When you're feeling so lost, pray to Waka that you find your way.
We're all part of the tree of relationships, and this means that change is the responsibility of every one of us. Learn more and get involved today.